from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and coming up for you today, K-State's Romulo Lollato will look at winter wheat planting progress in Kansas, offering advice for you producers whose planting has been delayed by uncooperative weather, as well as for those who intend to plant wheat after soybeans that will be harvested late. Following Romulo, then, K-State's Jeanne Falk Jones, discussing what K-State research says about the ability of summer row crops to withstand an early hard freeze, in that many acres of late-maturing corn and sorghum in western Kansas are right in the path of an expected cold blast over the next few days. And standing by with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, right here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, obviously, we're into the wheat planting season here in the state of Kansas, and we've welcomed by now wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato of K-State Research and Extension to talk about an assortment of things associated with our wheat seeding at this time. Romulo, much as we had suspected it might be a struggle to get this wheat in, the weather actually turned out to the point where we are fairly well on schedule with our wheat planting in Kansas, right?
Hi, Eric. Yes, well, if we look at the data that the USDA puts out every week, they are suggesting that Kansas is at about 45% planted for winter wheat in Kansas this year. That compares quite closely with a 47% 5-year average, right? So according to the USDA, we would be on schedule. Perhaps what we cannot see in that number is really the distribution of these. I believe that most of the fields out in the western portion of the state, so northwest Kansas, and going south into that Leoti area and south into Garden City and that southwest part of the state, that's probably where we've seen most of the development in wheat planting. In central Kansas, we're probably, at least based on this last week weather that we had, we probably didn't see much in terms of development of wheat planted area in the central part of the state. Again, there was quite a bit of rainfall right in this last week that would have held growers out of the field. So I think overall as a state, we might be on average, but probably what's happening is that out west, growers are more on pace. Many growers perhaps already finished planting their wheat crop, whereas in the central part, we might still be maybe a little bit behind. We need to also think that recently there has been a shift in area in central Kansas. There's a lot more soybeans today than we had a few years back. And a lot of the wheat that is going to be planted almost as a double crop following the soybean. So it's a late planting that needs to wait until the soybean is harvested. Now, one point of concern that I have, at least, is that a lot of that soybean this year was actually planted late. Right. So we had a lot of rainfall in that May-June time period, and a lot of the soybean got planted late. So I'm concerned to see how much of that is actually going to turn into wheat, just because it's probably going to delay soybean harvest as well. So, yes, we are on pace in the state. Probably as we get a little bit more into detail, we see that western portion is more on pace than probably central Kansas.
I want to ask you, there may be some occasions, especially in northwest Kansas now, where planting has not occurred, was delayed, and even to this point hasn't happened. For producers in that situation, in that part of the state, are we past the point of successfully planting winter wheat?
No, definitely not. We are past the optimum point, right? So probably if we think of Colby and northwest of there, and even a little bit south, if you go down to the Tribune area and Leoti area, I'd like to be planted there on September 25th, September 27th, more or less. And we're looking at long-term variety trial data, and we're seeing that that's the best point, right, for that northwest part of the state. So we are perhaps 10 days to 2 weeks behind the optimum. That doesn't mean that we can't plant a wheat crop yet, but it means that perhaps from here on we should be looking at some adjustments to our management to that crop to make sure that we're compensating for that delayed planting.
That would be in terms of seeding rate then?
Yeah, so if we are delaying planting past the optimum, as it is happening for that part of northwest Kansas, the first thing that I would look at is increasing seeding rates. Some of the research has shown that probably increasing about 10% or so per week that you're passing that optimum can really help to compensate for some yield loss. Now, there is a point where you can increase seeding rate as much as you want. That yields are not going to be the same. The potential is just not there if you're delayed too much. Let's say October 20th in Colby, for example, is a month past the optimum. The yield potential is going to be lower in that crop. But increasing seed rates help to achieve whatever yield potential there is still there. The other management practice that we talk about whenever wheat is being sown late is in-furrow fertilizer. So the application of either DAP, right, diammonium phosphate, or mass, whatever fertilizer that has a phosphorus and perhaps a little bit of nitrogen as well, that can be applied in furrow with the seed is really going to help boost that early season development. The vigor in the early season, the amount of tillering going on as well. Because let's remember that the major problem that we have with delaying planting date for wheat is that we're running out of temperature, really, right? If the later we plant, the less time the crop has to develop in the fall and to form those tillers during the fall that are much more productive than tillers formed in the spring. So that's the biggest concern that we have. So if we're increasing seeding rate, we're compensating less tillering with more plants. If we're providing furrow phosphorus fertilizer, we are trying to maximize the amount of tillering that plant is going to have, because that in-furrow phosphorus can help with tillering. So those are a couple of things that are easy, perhaps, to accomplish, but depending how late it is, one could also consider switching varieties, right? Some varieties are just not well adapted to being planted late. Others do better when planted late, but that perhaps a little bit more difficult decision because by that time, probably all the seed has already been purchased.
All of that advice, though, would also hold for producers elsewhere in the state who might be planting after soybeans, for instance.
That definitely would, Eric, again, because we need to wait until soybeans are harvested, and that puts those fields into a later planting and a lower tillering potential, a lower yield potential as well. Yeah. So that definitely applies those recommendations of increasing seeding rate, applying furrow phosphorus fertilizer, and making a good variety selection for those late sowing dates. That definitely applies for producers who currently have their soybean on the ground and are intending to go for a wheat crop.
Now, we don't want to overlook there are parts of the state that are dry, and not just a little dry. Southwest Kansas has been truly fighting it here the last several weeks and really needing moisture. There might be some extra considerations as far as sowing that wheat in dry soils.
Yeah, so the southwest part of the state has really been dry. They missed some of these rainfalls that we had last week, although I believe in the Oklahoma Panhandle they got about an inch or so. So some parts of that Panhandle were actually quite lucky, but we do have a portion of southwest Kansas that is actually quite dry. Whenever we're sowing wheat into dry soils, we typically have a very good seed distribution, right? Because there's really no mechanical impediments for that seed to be distributed. So typically we do get a pretty good seed distribution. But if there's no moisture there, the seed might sit around even for a few months and not germinate. We saw some of that in 2017, again in southwest Kansas, where many fields were just dusted in, no moisture at all. They couldn't even plant deeper to go after moisture. So the recommendation in that case, if there's no moisture within probably 2.5 inches, it's probably just planted the optimal depth, perhaps even a little bit shallower. So if you have some rainfall, you might still have a good emergence, right? So you don't need a full inch or 2 inches of rainfall. If you plant a little bit on the shallower side, perhaps half an inch of rainfall or even less might do the job and get a good emergence. So that would be probably the recommendation for those situations where you're sitting into dry soil. We need to remember that your planting date is going to be very different from your actual emergence date, right? So you might have already planted it and the emergence might not occur until a rainfall, and that might be sometime in October. or if it's anything like 2017, it might be in February, right? So that's something that we saw in 2017, were fields that got dusted in. There was no rainfall up to, I believe, sometime mid-January. We saw those fields emerging in the later part of February. And historical research shows us that those fields that are emerging in the spring, they actually have about half of the yield potential, typically, of a fall emergent crop. Hopefully, we don't have that situation, right? Hopefully, we have some rain that comes by sometime in October and still provides a very good emergence, so we have a decent stand going into the spring.
All right. As we all know, the state of Kansas is one of weather contrasts. We've places in the state, as of the recent rainfall, that are still overly wet. So just as one final thought here, those who are waiting to plant in soils that are too soaked up right now, you've always encouraged producers to remain patient and don't plant too early into overly saturated soils.
Definitely, yeah. So there are many challenges on going into overly saturated soils and trying to get a good stand establishment. One of them is that the soil is overly saturated, just mechanical problems. You're going to create compaction. Another one that is very important is just uniformity of seed distribution, right? So there will be many challenges with planting in saturated soils that might result into seeds that are not well distributed. So later on, you might see clumps of seed all together that will emerge very close by, and then perhaps a whole foot or a couple of feet without any seed. That's just from mechanical impediment from those wet soils. And I know that's something that is challenging, right? To suggest not to be anxious. I completely understand that, but just don't hurry into it. Wait for a couple of days for it to really dry out, 2 or 3 days, depending on the soil texture, might be a little bit more than that, and on the tillage practice as well. But yes, we definitely do not recommend planting in overly saturated soils.
All of this considered, by and large, we're off to a decent start with winter wheat planting here in the state of Kansas. Let's hope that our producers can continue on track with their planting, and we'll have you back quite soon and talk more about some things to consider as that wheat begins to emerge here in the coming days and weeks. Romulo, thanks for coming over.
Thank you, Eric.
Those thoughts from wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension. He's been our guest on this part of Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. As typical in Kansas, our weather can turn on a dime, and in parts of the state, that's exactly what's expected to happen later on this week, as our first threat of a freeze will be showing up in parts of northwest Kansas in particular, perhaps other places in the northern reaches of the state as well, over the next few days. And as we know, a number of our summer row crops aren't all that far along and may be susceptible to freeze damage. Want to visit about that now? Look back on considerable K-State research on the impacts of fall freezes on summer grain crops with Jeanne Falk Jones. Jeanne is the multi-county agronomist for the Sunflower Extension District, comprising that Wallace, Sherman, and Cheyenne counties. And Jeanne, your area is right in the bullseye of the possibility of freeze damage. In fact, you've discussed this with many a farmer in the last few days, you tell us.
That's exactly right. You know, we're listening to our forecast, and it's really nice out here for the next couple of days. But come Thursday, things are going to kind of switch gears a little bit on us, and our overnight low on Thursday is predicted to be in that 20 to 22 degree range. And so I think everybody's a little concerned about some of our sorghum and our corn that's maybe not quite to maturity yet, and what really our effects are going to be on some of that. So I think everybody's feeling a little bit concerned about this forecast for the next couple of days.
Well, just for the record there in your area, both corn and sorghum are running a bit behind, or is one ahead of the other?
Well, I think sorghum is probably our concern that we have the most, and a lot of that's just because, in general, we can have some concerns with getting sorghum through its growth cycle and getting cleared to maturity before a freeze, just because of our elevation here on the very western edge of the state. And so we have some concerns with that. We also have some corn that some of it was replanted pretty late because of some hail events that moved through, and so we have some localized area of some corn that we're a little concerned about too.
Well, a good part of our purpose here is to look at K-State research over many, many years' time, actually, which dug into the impacts of freezing temperatures and connected that to the time of crop exposure to those freezing temperatures, what that suggests about damage potential. Let's start with sorghum and what we know there.
Okay, I think, when we start talking about damage from freeze to any of these crops, we really have to look at the crop maturity, how far it is through its growth and development, and then look at how long it's exposed to cold temperatures. And so there's a study that always seems to kind of show up when you're looking up sorghum freeze damage, and this is from a study at K-State here from several years ago, and it's really going through and talking about when sorghum plants were in the grain fill, and they exposed them to temperatures of 32 degrees, 28 degrees, 24 degrees, and they put them in these conditions for 2, 4, and 8 hours. And what that's really showing is at the 32 degrees, there wasn't really a lot of reduction in the weight of the grain. However, when they were in 28, 24 degrees for more than 2 hours, that's really when we were seeing some detrimental losses on our grain sorghum. And so the sorghum was not at physiological maturity. It was in grain fill, and you can see as we got colder and they were exposed for a little bit longer, that's when we had the most damage to that.
Corn, sort of the same pattern, do we see?
Pretty similar to that. That's exactly right. And so when we're thinking about corn, first we're thinking about loss of leaf tissue, because that's really, the energy that's filling the ears of corn. But then we really need to stop and think back past just losing the leaves, what kind of damage would be done to that ear shank. And so as we get into colder temperatures, kind of that 28 degrees and below, we can start damaging that ear shank, and that's going to really inhibit some of the flow of the sugars and everything into that corn ear to really finish off those corn kernels and help them get to maturity. And so first we lose leaves, and then we start damaging the other portions of the plant. And very similar to grain sorghum in that respect is as we start getting the xylem and phloem, the pipes of the plant that move the carbohydrates and the water around. Once we start doing some damage to those, that's really when we start to see the more extreme losses on that.
So given those research-based conclusions, there could well be damage resulting from these freezing temperatures expected in later on this week, at least in your area. There are methods by way producers can go about assessing the yield loss from those cold temperatures, are there not?
That's exactly right, yes. And we actually have a publication that was put together a few years ago, but it's called Fall Freeze Damage on Summer Grain Crops. And this is a K-State publication from the agronomist. And it actually has some charts in there that kind of helps estimate some of the yield losses that we would be seeing for corn and for grain sorghum. And so I encourage everyone to stop and kind of go through that. There's many charts out there that are going to kind of talk about what kind of yield losses that we might be seeing from this. For example, so when we look at grain sorghum that's at that real hard dough stage, an estimated yield loss on that is about 27%. But that's just one example of what we could be thinking at. So you really need to determine the growth stage of your crop and then go in and look based on that of what kind of yield losses we could be seeing.
Just to note, Jeanne, that these charts that you're talking about are based on something that K-State researchers developed some time back, the heat unit method of identifying yield loss for both corn and sorghum. That's what you're referring to here.
That's exactly right. And that formula is actually included in that publication. Basically, what you're using is the maximum daily temperature minus the minimum temperature. You divide all that by 2, and then you subtract out what the base temperature is. Those base temperatures for grain sorghum, it's 42 degrees. For corn, it is 50 degrees. And so you can go through that. That formula is right in there, and you can go through and do those calculations yourself or kind of work through some of the charts that are on there.
And by the way, they have values for a number of places in Kansas, not just the Northwest, from Manhattan to Parsons, Hutchinson, St. John, Garden City, Colby, and Belleville. So reference that for sure. But one can also get a read on what's going on by visual inspection of their standing crops, can they not?
That's exactly right, yeah. You're really going to be just looking to see what's going on, looking at your growth stages, and you can kind of determine the growth stages. We have great publications that really can help you determine what the growth stage of your plant is, and what you're really looking for is black layer. You're looking to see if that black layer has went all the way through that sorghum or that corn kernel, so you really know where you are for reaching physiological maturity.
Very good. All of that in the aforementioned publication, as well as thinking about your options for utilizing a crop after it's been hit by a freeze before it reaches maturity. We won't dig too deeply into that, Jeannie, but producers have some guidelines here that they can work with in determining what's their best economical avenue for that stand if it has been hit by an early freeze.
That's exactly right. And it kind of just outlines some options of what you could do with this freeze-damaged crop. And I would tell you, as we're looking through these options for after a fall freeze, what I've been getting questions on is what guys can do before a fall freeze. And so there's been a lot more discussion on what you can do with a corn crop that's not quite, or a grain sorghum crop that's not quite through maturity. And so we've been having some in-depth conversations about things we don't talk about very much. I had a call last night asking about earlids, and seeing if that was an option for them for the next couple of days, if they could get some corn out and put it into earlage, and the values on some of those things. And so while we're going through all of this, it actually has some economics that go with it, and you can kind of pencil through some of that. Another great resource, if you're working through some of this, is to go to that agmanager.info website from the Ag Econ department, and they also have some options in there. But this publication is a really good place to start with that.
We've been leaning on it in our conversation here. It's entitled Fall Freeze Damage in Summer Grain Crops. You can go to the Agronomy Department website at K-State, agronomy.ksu.edu, or you've posted it, Jeannie, on your district website likewise.
That's exactly right. We have a link to it on our Facebook page at K-State Sunflower District Agronomy, or you can find it on a link to it on our agronomy page in Sunflower District Agronomy.
Excellent. Well, producers may have some interesting calls to make here in the days ahead in those areas where freeze is checking in. We'll see how it fares from here forward. Jeannie, we appreciate the comments right here. Many thanks to you.
Thanks for having me.
Jeanne Falk Jones is the multi-county agronomist based at the Sunflower Extension District in northwest Kansas. Again, Cheyenne, Sherman, and Wallace counties making up that district. And things to think about in as far as potential freeze damage to corn and grain sorghum in those areas which may be stricken by a freeze in the coming days. This is Agriculture Today. We're going to stand aside for a few minutes here. When we come back, we'll have today's top stories from the agricultural news page for you. Among those, a word from Todd Domer about tax relief options for you livestock producers who've been fighting extended drought. And indeed, there are parts of Kansas which have been contending with just that for quite some time now. And again, awaiting with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. All of that is still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today, now in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture. Eric Atkinson with you, and over now to today's agricultural news page and these headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Deputy-level trade talks between the U.S. and China got underway in Washington back on Monday and are continuing today. Those talks will then shift to higher-level officials tomorrow and Friday. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin will meet tomorrow and Friday with Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. There have been both positive and negative signals emerging ahead of the talks. Back on Monday, President Trump insisted that there was a good possibility for a trade deal with China, but he did not signal when that could take place. Trump administration officials and business leaders have discussed ways that each side could make concessions to yield a mini deal, so to say, to delay the October 15th and December 15th tariffs, or to jumpstart the drawn-out negotiations, that according to some DTN sources. Meantime, the U.S. continues to import more agricultural products than it exports, according to the USDA. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
A worrisome agricultural trade trend here in the last few months, with ag exports declining, ag imports rising.
For 4 of the last 5 months, we've had a negative trade balance.
Agriculture Department trade economist Cameron Doherty, we now have complete trade numbers for the first 11 months of the fiscal year from October through August. The August trade deficit was over $800 million alone, but Doherty says FY19 will still wind up with a trade surplus.
For the fiscal year, yes, we're still positive, and we still expect it to complete this year with a positive.
Of about $5.2 billion, but if you look at the calendar year, there's a chance, he says, we'll end up with an overall ag trade deficit. If that happens, it will be the first time in over 40 years. Back to the fiscal year, first 11 months, ag exports at $124.5 billion.
Down 6.5% from fiscal year 2018. Imports up 3%, and trade balance is down 81.5%.
Ouch. Exports down for corn, soybeans, and cotton, up for wheat. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
That package of reforms to U.S. biofuel policy, announced last Friday, continues as an attention point given the lack of some key details in that plan. The EPA is expected to release the supplemental plan and open the comment period with the goal of still finalizing the 2020 biofuel and 2021 biodiesel levels by the November 30th statutory deadline. One focus will be on how EPA accounts for small refinery exemptions. As EPA officials stressed last week, it would not be accounting for those waivers already granted. Biofuel interests will also want to see the specific increased levels for biofuel use in 2020. President Trump, meantime, will be in Minnesota tomorrow for a campaign-style rally. That could be the format for him to talk more about the effort, given Minnesota is a prominent biofuel producer and a state that has taken several steps to encourage biofuels use. In Washington this past Monday, the president said the deal will mean 16 billion gallons of corn ethanol would be used in 2020. While many Kansas ranchers have received an abundance of moisture this year, there are some who continue to experience extremely dry conditions. Todd Domer tells us here there is tax relief for those who have seen extended drought.
Ranchers who were forced to sell livestock due to drought may have an additional year to replace those animals and defer tax on any gains from the forced sales, according to the Internal Revenue Service. The one-year extension gives eligible producers until the end of the tax year after the first drought-free year to replace livestock sold. To qualify, the livestock sales must be solely due to drought in a region designated as eligible for federal assistance. Livestock generally must be replaced within a 4-year period instead of the usual 2 years. IRS is providing this extension to ranchers located in regions where any county in the area is listed as currently suffering exceptional, extreme, or severe drought, or severe drought conditions existed during any week between September 1st of 2018 and August 31st of 2019. All or parts of 32 states have been designated in these categories by the National Drought Mitigation Center. As a result, qualified ranchers whose drought sale replacement period is scheduled to expire December 31st of this year, in most cases now have until the end of the next tax year. This extension immediately applies to drought sales that occurred during 2015. More information can be found in Publication 225, The Farmer's Tax Guide, available at irs.gov. I'm Todd Domer.
Elsewhere in the headlines today, the USDA's plans to mandate the use of radio frequency identification of livestock in interstate commerce has drawn the ire of some ranchers who are part of a lawsuit attempting to stop the move. The ranchers, led by RCEF USA, allege in a new lawsuit filed last Friday in the U.S. District Court for the District of Wyoming that the 2019 USDA plan on radio frequency identification, or RFID, quoting here, unlawfully mandates the technology in ear tags and other technology for livestock. The lawsuit says the new plan quickly phases out the use of other types of animal ID, including those methods specifically approved by final rule issued in 2013. That rule governs the traceability of livestock moving interstate. It also allows branding, non-RFID ear tags, tattoos, group and lot ID numbers, and back tags. The lawsuit claims the USDA issued the RFID plan in April of this year without following notice and comment procedures. The plaintiffs are concerned the mandate will be costly for producers who would be required to convert to RFID technology. The petitioners are asking the court to declare the plan invalid. Quick calendar reminder here, research updates, the cornerstone of K-State's annual Swine Day. It is now set for Thursday, November the 21st. It'll take place at the Alumni Center here on the K-State campus. The afternoon sessions will include a talk by Josh Floor from Seaboard Foods on the decision processes and implementing a nutritional program in an integrated swine system. Also from Prairie Swine Health Services, Egon Brockhoff will take a look at the Canadian swine industry, what it's doing to prevent the introduction of African swine fever. Registrations are being taken now, and you can get a break on that registration if paid by November the 12th, $25, $50 after that date. And you can find out all of the information on the K-State Swine Day 2019 at ksuswine.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Crowbars are handy to have.
That's Gus Vanderhoven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
In the corner of my shed stand, among other things, 2 crowbars. A shorter one with a spear point and a longer one with a flat-pointed tip. They're both very handy and have been used. The shorter round one was found near the old pump location near the creek, which ran by the old farmhouse with the slate roof we owned. That was in Blacksburg, Virginia. One day while climbing up the bank, we stumbled across it in the leaves. We have treasured it and used it. The other one with the flat tip came to me in Kansas. Wayne, my son-in-law, gave it to me. It, too, has been used. The flat tip makes digging and widening a post hole very easy. Of course, you have to pound it and break away the earth. Don't call it dirt. but a tractor-driven post-hole digger is so much easier and quicker. But even if you set the pole, a crowbar can come in handy by setting it in the hole and correctly twist it and push the post over. Yes, you can quickly lean the post and tilt it. That's another way. Crowbars are handy to have, and I have two and treasure them. But I admit they're getting heavy, actually heavier, just like the chainsaws don't get lighter. It has to do with age. I've weighed the crowbar. It still is as heavy as it once was. The funny thing is, I did not grow up with crowbars. I did grow up with very heavy wooden sledgehammers, pounders, which could, with a mighty swing, pound the fence post into the soft ground. I was too small to swing it. Some of them looked like the hub of an axle wheel. They were just as big and heavy. It's amazing how a big, strong guy could swing it and drive a post into the ground with one bang. The post had been given a point, which helped. So, when I arrived in Australia as a young man and was given the task to dig post holes with a crowbar, it was a new experience. It was the summer of 1952. The soil was hard and the summer hot. The metal crowbar would turn hot too. Crowbar and shovel were the two tools I used. The shovel too was different from the Dutch spades. All new experience, but we adapted and learned. But I will never forget when I started to dig. I reminded myself of all this when I pulled a book off the shelf, in which I had tucked a photo of the now grown and retired children, the Reeves children, all adults. Anneke, my wife, used to babysit them while I worked the dairy farm on vacation from college. Stan and his wife, Margaret, would take a week off. I would run the dairy. I'd haul the milk to the road in the old World War II Jeep over the twisted and muddy farm road to the asphalt road where milk would be picked up and the empty cans stood waiting to be taken back and washed. Thinking about it, I can hear the Jeep engine growl as I plowed it through the ruts. It was a surplus brought over from New Guinea, a war relic. Remember, it was 1952. Having come across the old photo and a poem made by one of the sons in remembrance of how things used to be on the farm, I clicked on the computer and typed in the name of the farm, Gowrie Farm, Campbelltown, New South Wales, Australia. This time I persisted and I found what I was looking for. I recognized it, the house, the old buildings, the gentle sloping hills where the cows, all Frisians, and you say Holsteins, grazed. There were the old house, the milk parlor, and the farm sheds, a small, tightly held unit. Slightly off to one side was a stone building set apart. My friend Stan had started to build that for his wife Margaret, who was a Scottish war bride. The stone house built of huge blocks was a reminder of her homeland. In the photos I could see this structure, partly hidden by a tree. I knew I was home. I saw the roof of the building where I had my simple room, where I had my iron bed. The mattress was not much, and the springs were sagging, not good for a young back. I solved the problem by removing a door and fastening it to the top of the bed over the springs. Then I placed a thin mattress on top of it. Oh, I slept like a log. It's amazing what and where a computer can take you, and I'm not that computer smart. I don't think the farm is a farm as such anymore. I have to go back and figure that out. I do know this, that the town and highways have surrounded the hill farm, and across the road now is a botanical garden. If they wanted to save the farm as a unit of land, the grown children might have made a donation of it. I don't know. I will ask them. But all around are houses, no longer the wild foxes brought over from old England, yapping across the hills. It's funny to reminisce like this. In my mind, I see the cows coming down from the hilly pastures, no hurry, stopping at the water trough to take a long, easy drink, then walking to the holding shed, waiting there and turning into the milking parlor, 3 by 3, old-fashioned, but already modern to me, where we still milk by hand, even though there were some milking machines taken to the cows into the fields. That was the old country. The old country where I did not know the use and the good of the crowbar. I only have 2, but I have 3 sons. And don't forget the daughters. It'll be a problem.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That's our time for today. As always, thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.